Hello, Psych Night students. Professor Zeeb here, and welcome to another lecture for developmental psychology. This time we're going to be discussing the development of the teenage brain in adolescence. So definitely we're going to see some major changes in the brain when it comes to adolescence and so forth. And something that you need to know going in to the lecture here in terms of the brain research, we are still pretty early on in the game. So it's sort of early in the discovery of what's happening in the teenage brain, but obviously studies have been done and we've learned a lot. So but you have to know that going in that some of this research is in its infancy stage, so to speak. All right, so let's go to our slides and get into the specifics here of the development of the brain in the teenage years. All right, so it turns out that the brain is still definitely developing during adolescence, and believe it or not, the brain will not be completely developed well into our 20s. But we're going to focus more on what happens during the teen years, if you would. All right. So one of the things we've noticed about adolescent brain and development and so forth is that we use this term called context-induced plasticity, which is basically sort of trying to communicate that the brain is always changing. Okay, so it does change basically daily, is what we've discovered, but it also changes in reference to contexts or experiences that the person is going through. And so that can change the course of development based on what you're experiencing. So to build on that, we know that certain brain linkages mature earlier than others in the brain when it comes to adolescence. So for example, certain areas of the brain are pretty developed in adolescence, including appetite, sexual part of the brain, sensation seeking and risk taking, where other parts of the brain are not so developed. And those would include things like self-control, planning, reasoning, which will further develop as we go. I'm not saying that teens do not have that ability at all, but compared to a mature adult, we do see differences there. A lot of that has to do with this term we use called pruning. Just like you would prune your roses in the wintertime in you know, preparing for spring. It's kind of the same thing that the brain has many neurons and connections, and based on our experiences and developmental influences, uh, the structure of the neurons and the connections can change. In other words, we're going to find that some areas of the brain will become strengthened or even weakened depending on the experience of the individual. So that will continue. We talked about that in childhood. That continues obviously in adolescence. So let's get specific with some brain areas here that we're going to focus on in the lecture. This first one is called the corpus callosum. And if you've never heard of this is the fibers connecting the left and right sides, or hemispheres, as we would say, of the brain. As most of you know, we have a left hemisphere, we have a right hemisphere, which control the opposite side of the body. So my left hemisphere controls the right side of my body and so forth. And so these fibers allow the brain to communicate with itself and to process information. In fact, we have cases in psychology where that's actually been severed in people, and we've seen some pretty spectacular results of that, where the person may actually have two independent functioning spheres of consciousness, which is kind of weird to think about. But the point is here is that the corpus callosum will thicken in adolescence, which improves the processing of information in the brain. So we do see that change occurring in the teenage years. It's almost like the two hemispheres are cities, and the corpus callosum is the bridge or the path that connects both of them. So therefore, as this thickens and develops through developmental processes, it allows the brain to become more efficient in processing information. So let's actually take a look at this. So as you can see in the image here, it's referring to these fibers here that connect the two hemispheres. And so once again, that allows the left and right side of the brain to communicate and to process information more efficiently. And in the teen years, we see that that thickens. So that's one of the major developments we're going to find in the adolescent brain. Okay, continuing on. Next, we go to a structure known as the amygdala, which is this little almond-shaped structure near the temporal lobe in the brain, and it's thought to be the seat of emotions. It turns out the amygdala, this kind of interesting brain term, is part of what we call the limbic system, which helps to control emotions, but it also is involved in our reward system in our brain. In other words, receiving rewards and thinking about that and obtaining pleasure from rewarding experiences. So when it comes to the amygdala, we're finding through brain scans that it's almost completely developed by early adolescence. This has to do with the development of what we call spindle cells, which are neurons that are involved in emotion. And we see that this little structure is highly developed in adolescence. And we've even done studies where we've scanned this part of the brain as teens are making decisions. They have found that teens really rely on this structure, in other words, rewards, immediate gratification, for example, to make decisions. In other words, it may explain the influx of something called dopamine, a neurotransmitter, a chemical associated with pleasure, that teens are flooded with this during experiences and may seek to get that as a reward system. Okay. It may also explain the emotional moodiness that it is characteristic of the teenage years. In other words, being very emotional in nature. So as it turns out, during this time, teams are very reliant on that structure in terms of decision making. And then as we get older and mature into adulthood, we'll use other parts of the brain to factor in to that decision making process. Okay, so that will change as we get into our 20s. But for now, we're finding that the amygdala is a huge factor when it comes to functioning for teens. That leads us to our next structure, which is called the prefrontal cortex. We've referenced this earlier in the class in the chapters. So the prefrontal cortex, part of the frontal lobe of the brain, is involved in reasoning, decision making, and self-control. So to kind of relate it to, the class and development in the teenage years, we're finding through brain scans that this part of the brain is not completely developed in adolescence. In fact, there's evidence that it may mature approximately between 18 and 25, in other words, into adulthood. So it could be that your ability to make decisions is not quite on par yet. It's not quite up to speed. And then as we get older, our brain takes that information into account. It develops that and allows us to make more logical decisions, including thinking about consequences and weighing our options in terms of a decision. So what we found is that the prefrontal cortex has not matured to the point of controlling strong emotions and is also involved in decision making and uh, being in control. In other words, stopping ourselves from doing something or thinking about consequences. So another interesting thing about the brain overall is that by adulthood, the connections of the brain go from more focal sort of focus to more distant focus. In other words, as the brain develops, it relies on communication with more distant areas of the brain rather than specific areas. So the connection to distant brain regions will increase rather than being what we call focal in the brain research, which allows the brain to interact with several areas. And this has been linked to higher level thinking. So as we get older, our ability to do that will develop and change and allow us to really take in more data and to process more information when we make decisions, for example. All right, so let's just kind of summarize those findings. And if you're more visual, this will help you here. So here's just some of the brain areas we talked about: the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in judgment and decision making. Okay, so that's this region here. Remember, that will not develop until about early adulthood. The corpus callosum, which we showed earlier, is the connecting factors in between the hemispheres. Okay, so that will thicken in adolescence. We have the amygdala, which is this little almond-shaped structure here, which is highly involved in emotions. Okay, so we said that teens really uh, draw on that for decision making and thinking and so forth. And then we have our limbic system, which we mentioned. So just reading up the slide here, lower subcortical system in the brain, that's the seat of emotions and experiencing rewards. The system is almost completely developed in early adolescence. As we said, teens are often flooded with the neurotransmitter dopamine to make us feel good and have a feeling of pleasure, for example. And so that is often factored into decision making with teens. All right. So hopefully that has sort of clarified what happens with the brain with adolescence. Okay, so please continue with the course. Look at other videos I've posted about brain development. Of course, read that in the chapter. And we will see you next time in the next lecture.